Hello and welcome to another episode of Building Success, a real estate podcast. My name is Nick, and I will be your guide once again as we talk to some of the best and brightest in the worlds of real estate tech, operations, and financials from across the globe. This podcast would not be possible without listeners such as yourselves, so if you like what you hear and you want to hear more of it, please think about liking or subscribing from iTunes or Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, anywhere that you get this podcast. We would really appreciate it. So today on Building Success, I am excited because we will be doing the first of a series of panels that came from the International Users Conference that MRI held in Atlanta, Georgia here in October. And with me today is Andy Welkley, Product Marketing Manager at MRI Software, who was a moderator for one of these panels. How are you doing today, Andy?
I'm doing great, Nick. Excited to be here.
And before we dive into the recorded panel, I just wanted to talk to you about what it was that you achieved, who it was you spoke to, what our listeners might get out of today's episode.
Well, we had a fantastic panel. We had Melissa Bartow from Measurabl, we had Geoff Lewis from Honest Buildings, Scott Morey from GPG Advisors, and Brian Wong from Waypoint. Brought a wealth of knowledge and expertise to the panel and had a really good dynamic interaction, which I think your listeners will really appreciate, not just the depth of their expertise, but their ability to really share their thoughts and ideas.
Great. So what was it that you dove into?
Yeah, we had a real timely discussion. We talked about the advent of shared space around WeWork and other similar asset classes, that emerging process, and how that's changing the relationship that commercial landlords have with not just their tenants, but also their tenants' tenants, and
Sure.
what that means. We also dove into a little bit of sustainability, which is a hot topic now. And we kind of rolled that all together and talked about how urban settings are changing with the advent of Lyft and scooters across and drones, really changing the dynamic of buildings and how people consider renovating or redeveloping buildings in an urban setting.
Awesome. So I was there for some of the panel. It was really good and productive. And for you at home listening, this is live from the session. We put a microphone right at one of the seats, so it's just like you're there. You'll hear all the little pops, noises, sounds, but we really do hope you get something out of it. We plan to release a couple more of these that came from the International Users Conference. So thank you, Andy, for your time. And without further ado, let's get to the panel.
Thanks, Nick.
One of our biggest goals as we prepare for this session and this conference in general is to meet and interact with as many of you as possible. Many of the sessions engage your analytical brain. We ask you to watch demonstrations and learn more about the products and how to use them. But as part of this year's IUC, we're looking at engaging the other part of your brain, the creative, the thinking part of your brain, as we look at trends in the industry, as we look at things that we're seeing change and that we think will affect your businesses going forward. So in some ways, you guys are test cases as we try to integrate more of this thought leadership, more of this panel discussions into the IUC. That being said, these are not forward-looking statements and cannot be taken in any way. You've seen these slides several times, but we really do appreciate the people that come and participate with us, spend their time and their expertise in the Expo Center and interact with all of you there. And really, this conference wouldn't be possible without companies like these who support this effort and the way that we're able to communicate with all of you. So thank you to the sponsors, and especially the four of you today. I think you've all been scanned. We actually have our best scanner in the room here today. Emily's been doing yeoman's work, sometimes doubling up on sessions. So only 2 more sessions to get scanned, and you can forget this slide forever too. We are actually really lucky today. At MRI over the past year, we spent a lot of time producing content that isn't necessarily product related either. On Wednesday, we release a video, usually 3 to 5 minutes, about a different topic every week. Sometimes they're a little bit more product specific, sometimes they're really high level. We call it our Whiteboard Wednesday series. Follow MRI on LinkedIn, and it's published every Wednesday. We usually try to take a cross-section from the company, whether it's from support or product management, or even we let some marketing people talk once in a while. But I think another interesting part is our podcast series. It's called Building Success. on all the podcast channels and outlets. And today's session is actually being recorded for a future podcast. So we're excited to really share all this expertise out there. And I encourage you to check out both of those resources as you think about your work and your companies. So without further ado, we have 4 expert panelists today, and I'm going to let them introduce themselves, and we'll start with Scott.
So my name is, can you hear me? Just curious. I'm glad everyone's awake, by the way, so. I didn't have coffee, so it's a little dodgy, but anyway. Scott Morey, I'm a partner with GPG Advisors. We're a real estate-specific management consulting firm, primarily focused kind of on organizational, operational, technology stuff. Probably 70% of what we do has some form of technology, but we'll do a lot of work that might be pure kind of organizational process, strategy type stuff. So I'm based in Chicago, and then we have offices in New York and LA.
Brian Wong, Head of Client Experience at Waypoint. Waypoint is a proud partner of MRI. In addition to sponsoring the conference, Waypoint is a performance management software platform for asset managers and property managers in the commercial real estate industry. We're located in San Francisco. My specific roles overseeing our relationships in the market with our both existing and prospective clients.
Hi, I'm Melissa Bartow. I'm with Measurabl. We're a commercial real estate platform for all property types. We help them measure, manage, and act on sustainability. My role there is I lead all things partnering.
Hi, I'm Geoff Lewis. I'm Chief Product Officer at Honest Buildings. And Honest Buildings, we help real estate owners provide software and tools to manage their construction more effectively. And we've partnered really closely with MRI over the last couple of years, and actually just announced a new partnership on stage yesterday. So we're really excited about that, and excited to be here. And didn't know this was going to be on a podcast, so we'll be extra cogent in my remarks this morning.
And Jeff and I are going to be doing a dance most of the morning as we pass this back and forth. You want to just do that? Okay, sounds good. Just on the fly, I like it, flexibility. The first topic we're going to kind of address today kind of revolves around an article we saw as we were beginning to prepare this panel, that WeWork is now the largest leaseholder in Manhattan, surpassing JP Morgan, with over 5.3 million square feet under lease. And we're seeing this trend of shared spaces really take off. And I wonder if we could start with Jeff and get your kind of observations about what you're seeing and how that's impacting commercial real estate.
Yeah, absolutely. So Honest Buildings, we're almost 90 employees now, based all in New York City. And one of the things that's been really interesting is as we've grown from, when I joined the company, there were about 7 people 5 years ago. Now we're 90 folks. So it's been, there's been a lot of growth. The entire time we've been in WeWork space and continue to be today. Eloise, who's one of our employees, can attest that we're extremely jammed up, us 90 employees in our current WeWork space. But I think we're probably in our 4th WeWork space. Effectively every year we've sort of moved up in office space. And I think that one of the things that's really interesting for us as we think about what new office space we're going to go into is it's extremely difficult to sign a 3 or a 5 or a 7 or especially a 10-year lease on office space, just given that we don't really know how big we're going to be over the next few years, and the sort of flexibility and optionality is super important for us. So I think as people think about some of these high growth companies, the traditional office space model of 10-year lease, high credit tenant just doesn't really work for us. And I think WeWork has come in, and I think when you think of WeWork historically, you think of these sort of small 1 or 2 or 4 person office spaces, but they've actually done a ton of work to get to these 20, 40, 100 person companies. And most recently they announced that they're actually going to be redoing UBS's corporate headquarters, right? And it's hard to get to a company that's much bigger than UBS. So I think they've sort of started at this very small kind of micro office level with this much more flexible space model, month-to-month rental space, and now they've sort of expanded up into effectively the enterprise and everything in between. So I think it just creates a huge difference in the market. Like everything in commercial office is focused around that 7 to 10 year lease and creditworthy tenants. And when WeWork comes in, I think that has the opportunity to really, really change the way people think about office space, the way people finance office space, build office space. So I think it'll be a really interesting next few years as they continue to grow.
Brian, why don't you talk a little bit about the time horizon? Jeff's mentioning 7 to 10 year leases, maybe playing a different role or maybe seeing different things. So what do you think about the time horizon of this trend and how it might change over time?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think you definitely are seeing it becoming more mainstream. Equity Office recently rebranded as EQ, and they've partnered with Industrious, which is a WeWork competitor, to kind of get into this space. Certainly, from a time horizon perspective, it seems to be here to stay, not just a flash in the pan. And I think as you see more high growth companies, particularly in the technology space, is becoming the primary type of company that is making up tenants in commercial buildings, especially in office. You're going to continue seeing that because, to Jeff's earlier point, as a high-growth tech company, you don't really have the luxury of locking yourself into a long-term lease, especially when you don't really know what's on the horizon in the next couple of years, given fundraising. If you want to double your headcount in the next 2 years, or even shorter. So, I think it's certainly something that you'll continue to see throughout the market.
Scott, are you seeing maybe an emerging asset class here that requires a different management tool or technique to approach this?
I'm going to answer that in a second because I'm going to make a couple of comments. It's interesting though too with WeWork. I mean, it's not economically viable, right? WeWork. It isn't at the moment. I mean, you can look at their numbers. Not saying there's not value relative to their product base. And what's interesting with Industrious actually is it's half the price point as WeWork. Of course, it's a much smaller portfolio. WeWork also says their average company is 1,000 employees now as their target, and who they're going after and within their space, which then contradicts, I'm not saying it's wrong, relative to what Industrious and kind of what the market's doing. So I think we're at this funky kind of inflection point, and there's value around and things to learn in the design of the space. And then when you look at it kind of further, I think it's around what people are so focused on the tenant engagement side. What experience or services are you trying to provide as part of that? And you've got this mad dash of all these people like Equium or Lane. There's another 15 applications out there that are targeting sort of the tenant engagement piece, which means a lot of different things. We could talk about that probably for the rest of the day. But what you're seeing, I think, and going with Equity Office and everyone actually, whether it was Vornado or Boston Properties or a bunch of you are here, I'm sure is everyone's now trying to position what that means to them. And do they partner and do a JV like EOP with Industrious and create something, do their own product type, what kind of shared space they do, what kind of services they provide, do they have common areas that people can rent or meeting areas? And so there's a lot of activity, and we're doing a bunch of projects on a couple are global actually that are pretty sizable. It's interesting to see the geographic differences, but how do they solve that and how do they respond to that? And my fear with WeWork, going back to that announcement, is not to say there's not value in the product, but the balance sheet and the income statement aren't tying. So either price points have to get readjusted to a better line with demand with companies like Industrious that are coming more aggressively, although much smaller, or they get recapitalized at some point that aligns better with kind of the market expectations. So it's interesting. It's part tech and it's part physical, dynamics and design of the space. So.
Melissa, what do you think traditional property owners can learn from this type of emerging trend?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm glad you brought that up. I think what WeWork has done to the office space is totally reimagine what you want when you go to work. So typically you would build a space that you would go to work in, you would have a cubicle, you go to your desk, you might go to the coffee room, and you go home. WeWork has designed around building a community. So you go into an office space and there's free coffee right away, there's someone that greets you at the door, there might be a gym downstairs, there's happy hours weekly. And so really building on that community. And I think that's what also we're going to get into. The bigger discussion is reimagining the workplace. Is it a secondary home now for your employees? You want to spend more time there, so the employer is happy because now their employee's not working just the standard, 8 to 5. They're there in the morning because they know that's where they go get their coffee. They're having coffee discussions. They're staying later through the happy hour. What can a traditional property owner learn from that? Great question. It's all around design. Everything is design now. It's from the moment we open our iPhone to how we open a door. Everything's design centric now. So when you're thinking about whether you're in a multifamily, maybe even public housing, how do you create an experience that feels maybe less like a housing community and more like just a general community, or all your friends are over, and being more amenity rich, I guess.
That's a really interesting point. And we can talk a little bit about personal experience. In our setting at MRI, we're going through a complete renovation of our office. And we're losing conference rooms because we're growing. And that's not going to be a problem because they've designed a lot of shared spaces where people can collaborate in small groups for short periods of time or longer periods of time. And so I think, Melissa, you make a great point. Geoff, how's that playing out in your business?
Yeah, I mean, I think I think one of the things about, WeWork in general is that if you do look at some of the spaces they have for folks to actually do their work, like where your desks are, they're extremely small, right, relative to what your sort of typical expectation is from historical office space. And so I think that, maybe if I was a desk partner with you, we'd be like this close to each other, which, is just a different style of working. And I think that, the trade-off for being that close in sort of your like core physical desk space is that it allows for all these amenity spaces, whether it's the kitchen or the open area or extra conference rooms, things like that. And so I think that's, very much in line with what you're describing, which is, as people work more collaboratively together, as, people stay later in the office or, spend more time there, there's sort of a desire for less of just like a home base at your, sort of cubicle and more of these like flex spaces that allow you to sort of, build on the fly, sort of like collaborations with your colleagues.
Has anyone walked into anyone in Regis space? God, it's like a time capsule. You have to do it for fun. I swear to God, it's so depressing. Like, we were looking for a new space in the market, and we ended up at WeWork. I'm also an industrious user. And I look at Regis space, and it is the most depressing thing. This is being recorded, so this is not going to go well for me. I've ever seen, actually. So you should just go do a tour. Go, I can't believe people actually function in these environments. Like, it's like medicinal, I guess, or something. I don't know how to word it.
You bring up a good point, though. I think like WeWork has branded itself so well that I hear in the market, like you go to a WeWork space now and you don't feel like you're your company. Mm-hmm. So you feel like you're kind of a split brand. You might have clients there. So one thing that I'm curious to listen to what WeWork is as they build out spaces for UBS and these larger companies, do they brand it also as the company? I think that's going to be essential to some. I don't know how they're going to do it, but they're going to have to definitely have a bit of that mix.
We're talking about how tenants are engaging their employees or companies are engaging their employees in these spaces. Scott touched on the tenant engagement piece. Brian, what are you seeing in terms of how tenants' expectations of their landlords are changing?
Yeah, well, I think, everybody's talking about the millennial workforce these days and how those expectations are changing. And, certainly I think a lot of that has to do with just that generation's attitudes towards their work and what they view as work being very core to their personal beliefs. Specifically as it relates to the environment, certainly want to work in buildings that are sustainable from an environmental standpoint, have all the certifications, first and foremost. That's almost become the price of admission now for having a Class A office building is making sure you're LEED certified, making sure you're ENERGY STAR certified. But then on top of that, what can you also provide from a services standpoint? So we have clients that have started investing in luxury attaché services for their lobbies, really investing in, the chic furniture that looks like, the Hyatt lobby here in their lobbies, just to create that experience because, at least what we hear from our clients is, you're a tenant the moment you step out your door to head to work, and you don't stop being a tenant until you basically go back to your house, right? So how can we create that experience as landlords, moving forward, especially for our tenants, create that, holistic experience end to end throughout their day, because that is kind of shifting and mirroring what that workforce is starting to perceive as their values instilled in their workplace.
And Geoff, as you start to think about working with a tenant, working with somebody, thinking about reconfiguring their space or reacting to some of these things, what are some of the conversations you're having with those folks as they're thinking about making a move like this?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I think, just going back to our experience with WeWork, that I think has been very helpful for us is that, I think one of the things, especially as a smaller company, we don't have a lot of extra staff laying around who could manage a build out of new space, right? Or even once you're in space, ongoing management of that space to make sure it's clean and safe and, configured properly as new people show up is actually fairly difficult and requires a reasonable number of staff. And so, I think from our perspective, the ability to almost like outsource the project management of getting a space built out onto the our sort of sub-landlord in this case in the form of WeWork, that's actually very effective for us, right? Because our COO, the people who are head of finance, the people who'd have to be really responsible and sort of get stuck for months managing an architect and managing a contractor to build out a space that ultimately, will want WeWork like sort of space for our, employees. that's just a huge burden for a company to take on. So I think that's also one of like the underlying trends that makes a WeWork or an Industrious or a Convene or really any of these providers very attractive to smaller tenants, is that they have a lot of expertise around building out space that works for people, right? It's not that perfect Google branded space that they've spent so much time and effort curating, but it's probably 80% of that, right? And the ability to just sort of like show up, it's there on day one, and you can just sort of plug into that and have it be a pretty nice space that's pretty attractive to new employees, even if it doesn't wear your brand perfectly. Like that's just a really attractive sort of thing for us. And I think one of the things for landlords to consider is that they similarly have all sorts of construction expertise, but they historically haven't sort of gone for that last mile of really building the space out for the tenant. So one of the things you also see commercial landlords doing is creating all sorts of pre-built spaces, right? Where if you're trying to do a lease, you can show up in the spaces 90% built, 90% configured to, the SL Green standard spec, right? And I think that's also a response to things like WeWork. Effectively, tenants, especially smaller ones, don't want to show up and just see like an open, demolished space and then be like, cool, I'll move in 9 months later, once I spend millions of dollars on construction. So I think, just everything is moving towards more of this turnkey type format because managing construction is such a pain, and the people who have the sort of capacity to do it are the folks who do it in high volume, like either a WeWork or an Industrious or a traditional commercial landlord.
It's interesting.
I was just going to say, and the snack pantry is never empty because the WeWork is responsible for that. There's always beer on top and there's always coffee. I think like those are like the small little nuanced things that don't cost companies a lot of money, and they're like little frills that there's tons of startups are talking about how many snacks they have and the beers and the amenities they have, and that is totally a win for WeWork.
Say printing though too. It's funny, right? Like,
Wi-Fi.
Yeah, to go buy your own printer and set it up and the network, and it's pretty funny. How often have you had beer? Actually, I'm curious.
How do we work?
Yeah.
I'm not in a WeWork space.
So I finally one day, like 4 months in, to go have a beer, and they were out. The tap wasn't working. It was the one time I tried. I'm like, so many days I can drink in the middle of the week, to win another year. Anyway.
Each of you has kind of talked about either significant growth in your own companies or working with companies that have really experienced significant growth in the tech space or somewhere else. How does a company manage that? And Scott, I'll point this to you. As a company's growing, how do they utilize that space and keep it flexible?
Well, again, that's the beauty of it was mentioned earlier, is just it's all month to month, so the flexibility of it. There's always some level of vacancy in there. So if you suddenly need to go from whatever, like 1 person, 2 person, 4 person, bigger, like I've been in the honest building space, you have like a wing really right on your side. They've got the flexibility that you can move with it. In most major cities, they've got multiple locations. I think in Chicago, where I am, they've got maybe 10 buildings. The first one they took was the old Google space, actually. I think it was 5 floors in River North. And so, anyway, it's very much geared for that kind of environment. We have, actually, of our office locations, only one that's permanent space, which is out of LA or something. But I don't think, it's not even about tech companies or other companies. It's not about millennials or not. The demand has always been there and was never really met. But the trick again comes on, I worry about, just in general, not even on this category, but relative to prop tech investment, is everyone's always optimistic in the beginning, and you end up, sadly, with the majority of companies end up being financially kind of imbalanced, and it gets recapitalized or adjusted. So I worry about that with WeWork, and there was a great article, was it in the Journal or something, New York Times, 6 months ago, that was going through their economics and stuff that had leaked out, and the sheer dollar amount of their lease commitments, which was in billions, and I don't think their revenue's broken $1 billion yet, actually. Their revenue's right. So you worry about the viability of them, but I don't worry about the viability of the idea, because there's enough other companies doing it, and enough of the office owners of space that are going to try to sell that in their own fashion. Hopefully not like the old space.
Expectations have definitely changed.
Yeah, you really got to go. I'm telling you, we should do a field trip after this. We'll go find Regis space and land.
All right, that's homework for everybody. Go out and find some Regis space and see what we're talking about there. I'm going to pause for a second. We'd love to get you guys involved too. Unfortunately, I don't have the same budget as Pat, so there's nothing under your chairs. But are there any questions you guys have for this panel? A chance to really interact with some of the experts out here? Monday, or the third morning of the conference? All right. Well, we'll transition a little bit then and talk about sustainability. Brian mentioned it a little bit in terms of some expectations around the way people look at the offices that they're moving into. Is it a factor in determining if it's Class A or not? So Brian, why don't you expand a little bit on that and the sustainability aspects?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's certainly driven by tenant expectations, but also by investor expectations, right? So as you see the asset class become more institutionalized, you see more of the pension funds and the insurance providers pouring more money into this asset class. Those also come with higher expectations with their capital to be tied to more sustainable investments, right? Just across the board. So you're seeing it not just driven by tenant demand, but also by investor demand. Secondly, I think you're not also seeing that just driven by demand, but then also by financial performance. So you actually are seeing buildings that have these LEED certifications, the Energy Star certifications, actually driving higher rental rates. Actually driving lower operating costs, right? And I think as folks look for greater operating efficiencies in their portfolios, particularly in the core funds with these Class A offices, you're going to see more of that.
But actually, I had a real job at one point, not doing consulting work. Not that consulting is not real work, but I was at General Growth Properties for 6 years as part of the executive team, and then in a prior life before Blackstone took him out, I was part of the executive team at EOP. And the sustainability initially got branded as something, as a label, but a lot of owners didn't understand it, right? I'm going pretty far back in time. And then pretty quickly people realized that there was real quantifiable value in the bottom line. So you take the energy category, just, this goes in line, I'm sure the comments you're gonna have, just because of lack of transparency and people not knowing, by knowing, you're seeing people drop their energy spend 12%, 14%, 17% of really pretty big categories, not just office, I'd say for the various asset classes. So you suddenly take that money and real estate, this is getting recorded, this is not gonna go well for me. Historically,
we can edit it out.
Historically is cheap, right? It's a deal-oriented business historically, right? And so you'd say, okay, let's go do sustainability, and what's the economic lift? Well, now, the economic lift is there, and then you put that on a cap rate, and you're talking giant numbers, really, right? And so the certifications and the various agencies have provided transparency and sort of a way to measure it, I guess, in some consistent basis and be awarded for it. But the reality is that there's real money left on the table that still a lot of companies aren't doing something with. So it's interesting.
Melissa, I know we talked yesterday about benchmarking and evaluating some of that. What are some of the things you're looking at as you try to put those metrics?
Yeah, I would just kudos to both what you both said, that there's definitely money value behind sustainability, and I think it's finally there. I was at the Urban Land Institute fall meeting just last week, and there's people like Moody's Capital Markets are taking into account the sustainability, the risk associated with climate change into portfolios. So, and devaluing it, there's like a 7% devaluation of properties, commercial properties in flood areas and in sea level rise areas already. So it's a now thing. Maybe it'll loop this back to something I learned this week was public housing also has this demand. They have to report yearly their total utility usage to get operating budget from HUD, so the Housing Authority. So even if it's not this kind of, I say it's nebulous sustainability because it's this broad word, but really it's a matter of fact for them. So how can you create efficiencies for public housing to report their utility data? There's a lot of tech companies, Measurabl is one of them, that's automating that collection of data and allowing them to measure, manage, and report, in this case for public housing, their usage. And then we've made technology that enables that to peer benchmark. So, hey, what is another San Francisco or in Atlanta? So an Atlanta hotel, how is it performing to a similar building? So that's kind of that blind peer benchmarking, and then allowing owners or investors to think strategically around this benchmarking. Like Scott said, being able to then see the returns quickly.
When we all spoke on the phone a couple weeks ago as we were starting to talk about this session, Scott said get to the truth as part of this process. I think we talked about This is a nebulous concept. But what are some of the truths that we need to look for when we're presenting to investors or presenting back to a housing authority? What are some of those aspects, Scott?
Again, on the energy category is always the low-hanging fruit, that there's almost always real money sitting on the table. And the first stage is just trying to understand the various data points, and they use the term sort of base load. So if you imagine you turned everything off in your, whatever building type it is, you turn everything off that you can turn off, and you look at that load, you look at that number, and you'll find actually almost every asset class, it depends, people are conniving. Just saying, people are jumping onto that probably shouldn't, right? And so then you start layering on the various aspects of what you do, and you now got a metric of what it should be. And it's really simple things you'll catch, like the cleaning people leaving the lights on, which sounds like it's pretty, not a big deal. It actually is, it all starts really kind of adding up. And so for me, one is about the operating side and energy and utilities and water, and there's all kinds of, it's raining and you've got sensors, or somehow you're have an IP address, whether your water system, irrigation system, so you're solving that. But a lot of it just starting is about transparency. Now what's funny is you think about, I'm like the oldest one in this panel, by the way, although it's obvious probably in some ways, but you go back and you go back in time actually, and there's a couple categories of it. So one is about the construction and the development side, about sustainability, and GRESB, and there's other groups that kind of rate that stuff. And then you go relative to the operating side, and you've got a range of these categories that I think have real value and transparency. And where I was going is, if you go back to the 70s and think about when you had a computer, nothing talked to anything really, right? And I'm not that technical, but you had it's token ring or whatever, they had all these protocols. Now you just plug in your desktop, it just works, going back to WeWork or something else. That's what's happening with energy in some of these categories. They have protocols, which really comes down to a common protocol. They were battling for years, but BATNet's that protocol that allows the various pieces of equipment, energy, you to access them and communicate them. So a lot of times people think they got to spend all this capital to solve the problem. You've got companies, some of which represent here, that have easy ways to link in and gain transparency around what's happening with those things. And that's what's changed. Now, if you go in other categories like security, like access controls and doors, and they hate each other actually. They don't want you using anyone else. There's no common protocol. It's hard to work with. Relates to tenant services. But on energy and utilities and those things, it's pretty cost effective on a capital to do it, an operating basis, to figure out what you're doing and drop that number. So
I had a momentary flashback when you talked about the housekeepers leaving the lights on. I just could hear my mother. You're cooling the whole outdoors. You're heating the outdoors. Turn the lights off.
True.
And those are great things to look at. Geoff, what are some other things that people should be thinking about as they are evaluating types of projects or even kicking off a program like this?
Well, I think that the sort of idea there is that energy cost savings are extremely measurable, right? I mean, that's yeah, exactly. Happy to name me after softball. But I think that it's therefore really easy for the sort of deal people in real estate that you described to be like, okay, I'm going to invest $1 today and I'll get $1 back next year. That's a really clear and measurable ROI. And I think where some of the newer sustainability things are around well buildings and things like that. And so a lot of that is less related actually to energy usage. I mean, obviously there's something there, but a lot of that is how the occupants interact with the space, right? So things like daylighting or some of these sort of more maybe new agey strategies, right? That are much harder to measure, but at the end of the day, I think that's the type of stuff that's extremely important, especially for office or, hospitals or schools, right? You're not going there and paying money for that real estate except to, perform there, right? So, whether that's your office employees doing their work more effectively, patients recovering more quickly at hospitals, all that kind of stuff is extremely important, but it's really, really hard to measure, right? If you make an improvement to the way the lighting is in the hospital, does that mean people, recover faster? Super difficult to measure that. And so I think, it's hard for those types of investments to, for people to justify.
Less new construction, you would think, right? More so, but.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's obviously when you're starting with a blank canvas, you can do a lot of these things and, configure the space to get all the benefit for no real incremental cost. But yeah, so I mean, I think there's as we get smarter about measuring things over time, and everything, you can just plug in and it interoperates well. Maybe there's opportunities to start measuring some of these more ephemeral benefits today.
I think that's a great point, Brian. Maybe you could talk to this a little bit. We've kind of covered some of the aspects of looking at an investment or someone looking to invest in a space. What about the people who are occupying the space? Kind of building on what Geoff.
Yeah, no, I think it actually, what you see now is people focusing not just on the efficiency of the building, but the productivity of the tenants, right? And so, workplace productivity is now becoming that new success metric, both for tenants and for landlords, and how can they improve that, not just from having, better lights in the space, but having better daylighting, having better air quality. There are actually certifications out there now looking at that more holistically rather than just from an energy efficiency standpoint and more so from an occupant health standpoint. And driving and trying to see the ties of what these improvements do to yourself as an employee working in the space. Do you feel positive? Do you feel more productive? Do you feel more energetic in different spaces versus not? So I do think that's a big part of as we start thinking about that tenant experience, kind of trying to drive that productivity and making folks feel happy and productive.
Does it become a way that companies compete for employees? Melissa.
Yeah, I'm going to answer that question really quick. But something resonated with what you said, Brian, is you want people to feel productive, and I think hearing about like the whole theme of the MRI conference is like this interconnected, open, connected platform, and turning tasks that once were manual into like an efficient, automated platform. So if you think about that at a building level, like things that were just mundane of going to your office and not being able to plug in, trying to get onto Wi-Fi, like now it's so easy. Companies like WeWork make it so easy to make your work more efficient, kind of in the very similar fashion that MRI makes their software by being integrated and open, more efficient. But they paid me to say that.
You tied it right in, too. You did a great job.
Now, your question was,
Yeah, around employees or people who are occupying the space. Does it become a competitive advantage for a company to take this path?
Yeah, for sure. I think companies are branding themselves on what they offer their employees in the form of workspace. That's definitely a competitive advantage, and what we use at our company to market to people that we're trying to recruit. I think another way too is we're looking for a new office space, and we've written into our lease requirement that the building needs to be Energy Star certified, and needs to have a lot of these health and wellness amenities. So now going out to procure space, we're not only just trying to write software that allows other companies to do it, but also really walking the talk.
Geoff, who are some of the people in a company as they're evaluating taking on a project like this? Who are the stakeholders that need to get together and evaluate?
Yeah. Well, so one thing just to follow on Melissa's point, definitely just from trying to grow a company, like what we spend probably most of our time on is trying to recruit great talent. So if your office space is dimly lit or, there's a lot of ambient noise outside, it's really hard to, get people to, be like, choose your company over the many other companies that are out there. So that's a big deal. In terms of the stakeholders, I think it sort of depends on what you're sort of, who you're describing, right? I thought Brian's point earlier that investors are one of these really important stakeholders where, if you're a local developer and all of a sudden a major pension fund comes in and says, hey, we want to support this project and be your JV partner, but here's our list of requirements. That list of requirements is going to be pretty long, right? And, folks like CalPERS, et cetera, would have real hard requirements around sustainability, around reporting requirements and things like that. And so I think that, we've done a lot of work internally at our company just looking at the rise of the institutional investor over time. And, institutional money, folks like Blackstone coming into the market has changed the way, sort of real estate's always been this like local game, and there hasn't been as much, there's been a lot of autonomy for the developer, the owner, to really set things up the way they want. And now that it's becoming much more institutionalized, and the money sources are becoming a little bit more concentrated, those demands really change the way people think about that stuff. So it's not just the tenants, pushing the owner, it's also the investor, as you mentioned, and I think that creates a pretty perfect storm for seeing real change in the market, which we've seen over the last 10 or 15 years.
It's a big undertaking to do this, to get certified, to go through a project plan. Scott, how would you advise someone to look at a cost-benefit analysis of kicking off a labor-intensive and expensive process to go down this path?
Well, you have to pilot it. You have to try. I think it's the only way. So you got to take some level of risk to decide you're going to spend capital on a pilot basis to evaluate, identify what those opportunities are. And there's enough data, going back to your points earlier, where pretty quickly, comparatively, you can kind of see where you stand at some level, and use that as a basis then to spend a little bit more capital than go all the way, or even comparative basis relative to your own assets or something. So I don't think, again, it's as complicated. I mean, it is complicated in some ways, but it's less complicated because there's so many companies out there now trying to help solve it and build the transparency and have the software and the products and the tools to make it easier for you to understand kind of what's going on. So that's really the only way of doing it. There's no magic to it. You're seeing some because of the ratings alone, and you're right, decisions are getting made both at an institutional investment level and on a lease basis that now are driving more momentum. And you would argue historically the A-level assets were the ones that always kind of were there anyway, or there earlier. And now, the B guys are getting beat up for it, or the A guys that aren't. You're like, okay, we got to go get certified, or we need to get whatever done, because it's actually impacting deals. And that's changing behavior as well.
Yeah, Brian, I think that's something you mentioned, that's almost a price of admission now for these spaces.
Correct, yeah. I mean, you could certainly poke a lot of holes, I think, in both Energy Star and LEED certifications. I think they're far from perfect. But certainly, I think folks look at it not for the actual environmental benefits alone. I think it's just more about having that sticker on your building, right? It's just branding. So like, especially in downtown San Francisco, where we're located, I mean, pretty much every building downtown has to have that if it's going to remain competitive on the market. And I think to Scott's point, just piggybacking on the benchmarking piece, I think it is very, very critical. You understand what your peers are doing, certainly establishing that baseline to Melissa's earlier point, and trying to figure out where you want to go. Comparing across, all of the categories of your financial statement and what your goals are from a financial standpoint.
Yeah, and if I could add, another piece that's coming into play is the regulation around this. So cities are requiring buildings of certain size and asset type to report their yearly energy usage. Definitely in all the major cities in the U.S. and even some of the middle markets are making that a requirement now. And then states are coming online. So California as a state just passed a law a month ago saying that by 2030 the entire energy load is going to be 50% renewable. So what does that look like? How does it matter for a person that's managing one building? Well, now you're going to have that burden yearly to report your usage and do things at your site to be more energy efficient. So you'll see, outside vendors trying to bring in energy efficiency solutions to your property. And then I think, like city mayors are signing on. So there are about 1,000 mayors that have signed on to say, yeah, we're joining this fight too. So they can make these big, large statements like reduce your load by 50%, or reduce to renewable energy by 50%. But where the action actually happens is at that site level or that fund manager level.
Let's dig into that a little bit more. The cities are creating spaces where people can live, work, and play. Maybe expand on where you're going and talk about how those mayors are interacting with the property.
Yeah. So funny story, last week I was in Boston and the mayor stood up there and he had the thickest Boston accent. And I don't know about you, but when someone with a thick Boston accent that just talked about the Red Sox for like the first 10 minutes of the speech, then transitions straight into climate change and sustainability and how he sees him building his future city, that he has to have that in mind. That made me kind of like open my eyes, like, okay, this is a real deal. And all these cities are putting out climate action plans, making it really more real. To Jeff's point, it is that perfect storm, right? Because you have the money at the very top, those institutional investors asking for it, all the way down to that property manager having to enter energy data, water data, waste data.
Can you build on that a little bit more, Geoff?
Yeah, I figured after talking about the Red Sox for 10 minutes, they were then going to transition to the Patriots or something, but I'm glad they transitioned to talking about climate change. But yeah, I mean, I think that it's just I think the regulatory piece is super important as well, right? And I think there's just so much risk associated with spending money on real estate, right? If you're a developer, probably the biggest thing you think about is all of the risk you're gonna have to take to spend hundreds of millions of dollars. There's so much entitlement. There's so much, there's probably an 18-month or longer process just to get your property ready to, to be built. So I think the way the regulatory environment thinks about this stuff is huge. And I think one of the things that's really hard is, institutional investors don't move super fast, but they definitely move way faster than cities do. Technology moves, sort of at the speed of light, but the speed of regulation sort of always struggles to catch up. And so I think one of the things that ends up happening sometimes is that because for very rational reasons, regulation is there to protect people and not allow too much risk to be taken, especially when you're building buildings, which I think is logical. But at the same time, it doesn't always necessarily doesn't necessarily create the right preconditions for developers or owners taking risk and trying on, new initiatives. Scott mentioned, I think, that if you want to try something new, the best way to do it is pilot, right? You want to learn a little bit before you go all in, and I think that makes a ton of sense. But if the regulatory environment makes that difficult, then it can sort of slow the pace of learning and innovation. So I think, mayors and the other sort of folks that are key parts of the regulatory policy making machine, I think need to start to think a little bit about how you can allow for some of that pilot type innovation without, overhauling the entire system.
It's hard too, you think at the city level, because you can set policies or set metrics or require reporting. You can master a plan, but it takes decades. And what's interesting then is if you take companies in our space that have aggregate control and scale. So Irvine Company ranks, right? Just because in what they've done and continue to do in Newport Beach and Irvine, I think is really pretty interesting. You take Brookfield, because you don't hear about Blackstone Place, you hear about Brookfield Place. It's interesting, right? And these larger scale live, work, play type communities, and then you see subsets in certain parts of the world. The only one I think that might be really interesting to look at as a test case, but it has been decades still, as you'd say, Dubai. And they're getting more and more aggressive on tech, and they're saying cryptocurrency. They have the Dubai, I think it's Smart City Initiative, which is all about analytics. It's about city analytics, and the real estate owners there are being asked to contribute more than this energy utilization, a bunch of other items. But outside of that, it's hard, right? It just takes a long time in any individual city to sort of affect change that quickly, right? Because we just don't develop that many buildings. You don't tear that many down and rebuild. So.
Yeah, and one thing I'll add is, I think it's very interesting being a software company that, helps real estate owners manage construction because, we release new parts of our product every week, right? It's very easy software is very malleable, right? And you can write something and be like, oh, we kind of wrote it, in not the exact way the user wants it, so let's rewrite it and, push out an update next week. You definitely can't do that with a building, right? It's like you got to get it all right, and you have to build it in one at one time. And if you want to change it later, there's huge dollars of capital that have to be spent to reconfigure space. So I think that's also one of the real challenges is that reconfiguring the physical environment, there's no agile process like there is with software.
And it's interesting, the concept of moving back to the cities and these live, work, plays have kind of created their own challenges and problems for the infrastructure of the city. Scott, I think you mentioned one time that 30% of urban congestion, get this right, is
trying to find a parking spot. Yeah. It's really interesting, right? And people have been thinking about that's why there's so much emphasis going relative to what's happening within the parking space. And then more owners, because there's a lot of revenue in parking as well. And most people really aren't conveying the availability or utilization of those spots. I mean, it's come a long way. It depends on the cities, like Frisco's, right? San Francisco and Seattle are good. Chicago's like hit and miss or something. But there's a lot of focus going on, I think, relative to that, category. There was a company called, was a funny one called Spot Monkey or something, and it was genius though. It was piloted in Chicago when you're in core urban and parking in the streets tough. What it was is you would get, hey, I've got this spot, I'm already parked, I'll give my spot up to you for X dollars. So the car pulls up, you pull out. It's fascinating, really, right? But yeah, 30% of congestion in cities is parking alone, and of course, as real estate owners of whatever asset class, right, we are offers of parking spaces and users as well. So
it's actually interesting because in San Francisco now, the primary source of congestion isn't folks looking to find parking for their own cars. It's folks waiting for Ubers, Lyfts. It's the Ubers and Lyfts coming in from all different areas outside the city. The drivers don't know how to get around. They're just stopping in the middle of the street. They're holding up buses, you know. So that's actually become a big problem, and the city recently released a report that was basically blaming these ride-sharing companies for that.
People are swearing.
Yeah.
There's a great article, Deloitte put out an article about, because it aligns with autonomous vehicles, because it's still this thought that is congestion going to get better? And Deloitte, this goes back 2 years, and Deloitte argued it's actually going to get worse, and I kind of agreed actually, and the reason why was I've got 4 kids and a dog, and you could put them all in separate cars and let them go everywhere, right? Where now I've got like 2 cars or 3 cars, suddenly I could utilize 6 cars, which is pretty exciting by the way, 6 cars at a time, but you know, what does that do to congestion? We don't know actually. It's really interesting, right? And you're seeing that in a different way, right, within the city in San Francisco.
And we're seeing, in fact, I'm actually kind of lucky to be here, so I tried to take a scooter over to the party on Ponce, thinking that would be a good idea.
How'd it go?
I think I'm the wrong demographic. Not go well, but I made it, and I made it back in an Uber. But I think we're seeing this in a lot of different ways too. I didn't tell you guys about this, but you know, we see it in retail as well, as we think about the pressures that retailers are facing with e-commerce. And how are they addressing that? Well, they're talking about reconfiguring their spaces to allow people to order online and come pick it up at the store. But what does that do to the traffic patterns in the parking spaces or the way that the store is configured?
Putting in grocery stores. I was on the other side of that. You know, take an anchor and put it in a grocery store. Do you really want to go there in December at a mall to go shopping for groceries? It's tough, right? It's not an easy thing.
I saw a street art when I was on my run yesterday of like a multi-family futuristic looking house, and there's little cartoons coming out of it, and it was like, will Postmates deliver kombucha to me? And that just had me thinking, and Scott, you lit that light bulb, is like, people just want things delivered to them. They want it fast. It goes with the scooter thing. I don't even want to wait for an Uber anymore, so I see the scooter, I'm going to jump on it. I'm too lazy to walk down to the grocery store, even if it's cold or even if it's a mild temperature. Will they deliver kombucha like to my space? So it all gets back to the design, the community aspect of it that we started our conversation around is that instant gratification. We don't want to look for a parking space anymore. I don't know how it's going to change. It's to flip this also to like the future looking at garage spaces. I would love to hear your guys' input of what you think when we do go driverless cars. What does a garage space look like? And maybe Geoff, like, are developers looking at it all? Like going like, how do we position ourselves around garages?
Yeah, well, I'm just thinking about my future house with the 6-car garage. To Scott's point. But yeah.
Yeah. You thought you were going to get your garage back. I don't know anymore.
Yeah. So I mean, I think that all of those trends are sort of coming together, and then real estate developers are responding to that, right? So there's just all of this, massive growth in industrial warehouse development. And one of the large drivers of that is that people need to have distribution centers outside the city so that they can take all the e-commerce merchandise and then ship it into downtown. And at the same time, retail is sort of shrinking in general. However, that doesn't mean that retail is dead necessarily, because there's branded experiences like SoulCycle and things that are like growing like crazy. So I think that it just results in this massive reconfiguration where a lot of what retail is doing. And so Brookfield, obviously just bought GGP, and I think the idea there is, that's obviously a sort of nice contrarian bet in the sense that, if retail is dying, why buy one of the biggest retail owners, in the U.S.? And I think their idea is that there's a lot of opportunity to reconfigure that, not just to be a mall the way it traditionally stood, but start to have it be this sort of live, work, play type environment where, you can build a multifamily building on top of it. And, it's kind of unclear what that does to, parking utilization and things like that, as people are coming to the mall during the day or leaving, and then people come home from work at night, So I think it's not really clear how all those factors kind of merge together and then what exactly that means, but definitely means like a lot of reconfiguration and some massive changes to the way real estate has been done for the last 50 years.
Green Street, I don't know if you know for the Green Street, so they're more for the public guys, right, as a rating agency at Newport Beach. They did a report a year ago on parking and sort of what it meant economically. It had more of a, retail bent. And then the other thing you mentioned, Geoff, too, is When you look at the industrial's hot, right, in general, which makes sense in the volume and the shift of behavior. Having said that, and you probably know these stats, but if you pick by individual item level versus like boxes and giant pallets, the demand of the space is like fourfold, right? But you actually go to the large logistical, anyone on the industrial side in here or not? Okay, but it's interesting because you look at the amount of warehouse space or industrial space being used for individual item pickup, it's less than 10%, I think, actually. It's not, at least what I'm hearing, it's not yet as significant. It's interesting, right? So it means there's still a bunch of more lift on the industrial side, but it's not the number that you would think it would be. It surprised me, right? And I've heard these stats kind of a couple of times. I think on the retail side, every generalization there's some truth and not truth. So the thought is, can the A-mall guy is still going to live, right? And that's probably Brookfield's bet. And the C-level mall space is tough, and the Bs are a big question mark. And you know, we're 24 square feet per capita retail space in the U.S. I think the next biggest country is half that. So there's a belief that number is going to go down to about 18 square feet. The reality is I don't think anyone knows. I think they're guessing, but they know that we're over retail. So, yeah.
We're actually starting to see industrial and warehouse properties moving into the cities.
Mm-hmm.
And multi-story situations are evolving. And I think we're also starting to see the need for amenities in those spaces as well. That the people who are working in them have different expectations in their workspaces as well. And I can just see well, I guess it's going to be drones by that time, but the congestion can only increase as the delivery trucks need to come out into the cities.
I'll pick up on that drone piece. I thought it was pretty interesting. There's a company out there, and the name escapes me at the moment, but the drones, the airspace in between in a major city, like if you think of New York, that airspace that drones would fly in is actually not regulated. And so there's a company that's commercializing now and mapping the airspace. So when drones come to play, you can charge for a preferred space. So we're talking congestion on the ground right now, but I mean, man, I guess maybe in the next 20 years we're going to talk about drone congestion in our airspaces around it and regulating around that. So who knows what will happen, but that'll be a good conversation.
The Hyatt regulates drone space here in the hotel, by the way. We're just going to try to film one of the general sessions with a drone, and that was summarily dismissed by the hotel.
Yeah, well, and you can do geofencing, right? So like big stadiums when there's concerts, or the Padres Stadium I'm in San Diego has a geofence. You literally can't fly a drone over it. I think of that as a great technology they'll probably bring to scooters. So we're seeing scooters and line bikes trashing our cities. I don't know what it actually will look like, but a geofence in like walkways, or you can't put a scooter laying down in the lawn. I don't know, it blows up if you do that. I don't know. But
You blow up.
Yeah.
You go.
One beeped at me so hard the other day. I don't know what I did to it. San Diego is a great place for scooters. It's always nice there. It's barely ever raining, so it's a great transportation for us. When you really think about that last mile, like I don't really have to care about parking. If I go to a concert, I can park far away, know there's a scooter there, and ride the scooter in. But I was trying to park it, and I don't know what I did to it, but it would not stop beeping. I just ran away. So.
You're on a watch list somewhere.
Probably, yeah, and this thing's recorded.
That was Melissa talking there.
Only female voice.
Well, I mean, it's really interesting because there are companies out there now, like software companies, that are specializing in drone defense, right? It's like, okay, so you're a landlord, you have these drones just coming into your airspace, like how do you prevent that? And especially if it's an invasion of privacy with your tenants, right? So now you're seeing a market for these software companies that are tracking, they're monitoring, they're helping you, not just surveil your lobby against intruders, but also your airspace against intruders, right? I mean, it's a real thing. So.
No, I was going to say even the exterior of the buildings for augmented reality, people are trying to give the legal rights of the visual representation of their asset not getting used without their own control. It's crazy, would have thought, right?
So let's turn that around and talk about how those companies can attract people in. Talk about keeping them out a little bit. But let's take the mall setting, for example. What are some ways that a landlord could support their tenants beyond just kind of the upgrades or amenities? Geoff, are there things that they can do?
Yeah, I mean, maybe host a drone race inside or something, I don't know.
Fun, with beer.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
How we work, yeah, down the hall.
Yeah.
It all comes together, convergence, right?
I mean, I think at the end of the day, the landlord and their tenants, while maybe sometimes, especially during, lease negotiation, feeling adversarial. I mean, at the end of the day, it's a partnership, right? If your tenants aren't successful, the landlord is not going to be successful. And obviously that's extremely true in retail just because of the way the leases are structured. So I think that, for the landlord, like you were mentioning, C class malls are, on the way out. A malls are probably here to stay, and B malls kind of unknown, right? Well, landlords have to be, I think, pretty thoughtful about working with their tenants to figure out what's going to help drive traffic to that mall, and it's probably more than just like upgrading the signage or like redoing the landscaping, right? They probably are going to be more meaningful reconfigurations that they're going to have to consider. So I think it's just really incumbent upon and I think this is the same as it's always been for real estate, right? I mean, like it's all about, is your space driving value? Is it using its highest and best use? And so I think just as technology causes some of these changes in the way people use space to happen more frequently or at a higher clip, I think it's just more incumbent than ever on the real estate owner to be really thoughtful about, how their space is being used and what they should be doing to it to, make it profitable over the next, 5, 10, 20 years.
Take, for example, the Pond City Market, what Jamestown has done to it. It was a Sears distribution center, then a city hall. Pretty homeless people were there for a while, and then Jamestown came in and really revitalized the center. They did a lot of creative things to offer, cool tenant space at the rooftop, right? They're leasing out the rooftop and have a little carnival and have a putt-putt. That's unique. I don't think when it was Sears they had putt-putt on the roof. And then there's a garden, so people are putting these gardens on top of the roof and leasing a garden space out. So a retail doesn't mean that there's just like an Abercrombie and Finch and JCPenney's in it anymore. You can do creative things, and that's all in the scope of retail and what tenants want to create a space like, and what the consumer also, I think, is looking for.
Yeah, I think going back to the topic of the public-private partnerships and really trying to integrate with the community with some of these newer developments. One example is the Salesforce Transit Center in downtown San Francisco. I mean, that's been a big example, although right now it's closed because some of the steel beams have cracked, which is a little bit of a bummer after a couple billions of dollars of investment. So, but that being said, when it did open, I think there was a lot of excitement just because it was a really open space for the public. It was a park right on top of this transit center, which is right next to Boston Properties, trophy asset now Salesforce Tower, and so that's kind of revitalizing that neighborhood. So in terms of attracting folks, I think it does go to Melissa's point of integrating more with the community. Certainly redeveloping different neighborhoods that historically didn't have that investment, and you're starting to see some returns on investment from that.
I think you make an interesting point about transit affecting the way cities are growing or changing. Boston, not under Mayor Walsh and his Red Sox fandom, but the Big Dig, for all its pluses and minuses, created a beautiful greenway right through the middle of the city and tore down an 8-lane highway that really separated the city from the seaport. And the seaport has exploded in Boston. Even in the city I grew up, Little Rochester, New York, they tore down the raised highway. There we got another one. Yeah. The inner belt they tore apart. And they're in the process now of working with developers and working with public and private enterprises to figure out how to use that space again and take an old kind of crumbling city and inject some life into it. So I think that public-private partnership is an interesting topic. Scott, do you have more?
Well, part of your original question was about what services you provide, I think. And I think what's interesting is, goes back to a point Brian you made earlier, how do you figure out productivity? So in retail, it's sales per square feet. You look at traffic numbers. You can debate the value of traffic numbers. But ignoring that, you get sales per square feet, and the retailers report it. So you can see if you're doing something that's having an impact to sort of reinforce whether it's a service or whatever it may be, may be providing. An industrial, you can say you look at turns. Although most people don't really look at it, but you can kind of look at turns and some activity within there. In office, we don't know what it is. Is it on the energy side, is it actual productivity basis of employees? People are trying to figure that out. So if you take a company called Convene is a good example, and their Elevate platform, not the only one, is they're looking at utilization of space, like am I in conference rooms or not, which is helpful. But if you've already leased the space, I don't know what you do with that. It's like, okay, that's the conference room we don't use. But anyway, ignoring that. But the goal I think is how do you actually figure out that people are more productive or not? And that's beyond my pay grade or something. But there's something real that's there. And going back to the other comments you were making as well, Melissa, about amenities and the WeWork and all that, and we're happier about it. And in theory, if you're happier, are you more productive? I don't know. I don't know, right? Like, that's got to get figured out. And there's a lot of smart people looking at that. And I think that will ultimately change behaviors on the office side, the configuration of the space, whether it's lighting or other aspects, and also services. But until it gets figured out, we're kind of shooting in the dark a little bit, right? Unless whatever service is being provided, you can see economically kind of off that if you're getting a lift or not off it, right? Like if I integrate better with valet services or reserved parking or seamless integration in my garage, the garage utilization go up, or gosh, you can order food off my app, or you could, you know, have concierge services. Those have transactional kind of value that you can evaluate. But these other areas, I think there is value, but we don't know how to quantify it. That's the hard part.
Yeah, I think one of the proxy metrics that are being used now are the number of sick days that are taken across an employee base, or the percentage of sick days that employees take. And I think that's one side benefit of a lot of these landlords investing in fitness services in their buildings, right? And the tenants really being behind that is because a healthier workforce means, you know, less sick days for that workforce. So they're actually in the office more often and actually collaborating more often with each other, rather than being out of the office sick. And that's not just from, you know, personal health just for working out, but it's also, you know, providing healthier food options to your employees, right? When you cater for food and all this stuff. So I do think that personal health element is that first inroad to quantifying that productivity, but to Scott's point, I mean, we're such a far ways away from actually figuring out what all the variables are in that equation.
Like I bring my dog to work, it makes me really happy. But I don't know how you measure that. I bring my work, you know, I'm in Chicago, my dog's coming to work, but I don't know, right? It's funny. So.
My dog would definitely be happy if I could do that. We haven't figured out a way to pull that off yet.
Yeah. We work. Industrious, they can bring your dog. It's all good.
We've covered a lot of ground this morning, and again, you guys have the experts in front of you right now. Are there some things you're thinking about that you want to ask these guys to respond to, react to? Things you're seeing in your own organizations and companies? There's an MRI t-shirt in it for you if you ask a question.
Yeah.
Are you guys seeing any pickup in the retail space with geofencing?
Yeah, I'm not that well educated on geofencing. I just know it as a way of keeping drones out of ballparks. And I don't know about the technology, but I'm sure. In what aspect are you thinking of, like retail and geofencing?
So what we're looking at now is ways to gather the conventional demographic data, more analysis, where the shoppers are going, where the shoppers are coming from, where they're going in our centers, but then also there's geofencing or being able to provide metrics on where within a space shoppers are going,
Right.
to help them better, or configure the space better.
That was my part, like a little bit. I mean, the hard part with, you know, if you go off the Wi-Fi, they'll tell you can get like 3-5 feet in radius or 10 meters at best. And beacons, you need such a high concentration to make it meaningful, plus you need the app to do that. You can find there are 3, going back to mapping in garages, a whole funky area too. There are 3 companies that are mapping companies that they aggregate geolocation GPS data. TomTom, which used to have the old retail devices, right, for navigation and maps, is one of them. There's one called InRex, which quietly actually does all the algorithms for Waze and Google and those other guys. And then the other one is Here, which was formerly Navtech. It came out of Nokia, right, in Chicago. So those 3 at different levels are in the open market. You could approach them. I could give you contact information, and they can, based upon geo coordinates, can give you data. And there's some of that data is more meaningful than others, right? And going back, as part of V1 is origin versus not just source. So that gives you kind of more macro level. You can buy that stuff within the asset itself. You know, Wi-Fi data I still think is because it's an amenity and people are doing it and you can sell it and all kinds of funky things, is probably the best one, but you can't get it tight enough with the concentration effectively to understand. You're never going to get aisle level movement in the cameras. You could get store level movement and dwell times, repeat visits, and stuff like that. Companies called, other ones that aggregate Wi-Fi data that will give it back to you as an owner. Euclid does that, which got bought out by Comcast, I think, last year. Retail next. ShopperTrack kind of, after a bunch of lawsuits with Shopper Track because people are pissed off at them, but they're still around. 103. So anyway, I can share afterwards in more detail. And there's some other data sources, like going back to every store has to file a tax return because they got sales tax rules, right, depending on the county. There's actually a company that's aggregating that sales information, and they have to report on their like SIC code level, but it's pretty defined even in apparel. There's all kinds of funky things kind of going on that people are looking at to figure out behavior. So, sell data, Uber Media, not tied to Uber cars. They sell pretty finite, interesting data with demographics on it on Uber as well. There's a bunch of them. So, anyway.
There's a company there's a company, I don't know the name, but it's taking the satellite images over major retailers, so looking at like the parking lots of Best Buy versus Walmart on the weekend, and then selling that over to hedge funds who are then using that in their investments.
Yeah, even the analysts are beating up the REITs with it sometimes.
Yeah,
it's brutal actually. So, anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I imagine like Bird, the scooter company, could start selling that same travel data, right? Where are the people going? There's a lot of data play out there.
But cars, and some like almost half of cars now are emitting a signal. Here's what's interesting, and they emit their own signal. So you've got companies looking to do power stations for Teslas. You can actually, with Wi-Fi devices, you can recognize the signals and how many Teslas are in your property at one time. Like, it's getting crazy actually. Just turn it off. Turn it all off.
One just quick thing to add to that is, so we run work at a software company, and effectively we can measure and track every single click that's happening in our software product, and we use that to make better decisions about where to potentially sunset features or build new features or figure out where people are struggling. And I think that's again one of the huge advantages of the digital world, is that we can use that data in real time and then the next week reconfigure the way the software works to better fit what people want. And I think again, as real estate, given that it's such a physical asset and there's effectively no data on how people are using the space, I think there's really interesting opportunities for real estate owners if they can get their hands on that kind of data. So, just as you think forward to what it would mean, like what it would mean to manage a space, if you had full insight into how people were using it, and that goes back to your point about convene. I think it'd be really great if you're in a convene space and they say, hey, you're not using this conference room, think about reconfiguring it. That's such value add that a CEO or an office manager just would never have insight into unless they get that data and that insight from someone else.
You guys got a question back here?
So lots of conversation about the data. As an owner, you hear a lot more about owners hiring data scientists and doing all this stuff. Is there any, I'd be curious at the panel's discussion around, should owners be investing in data scientists? How are you, which sources of data should you trust? Are there market leaders out there that you should be looking at? Because there's data on your building, there's demographic data, there's retail data, there's data. It's everywhere. So is it a fool's errand to try to aggregate the data and do it yourself, or are there leaders in the space that we should be looking at from a real estate owner's perspective on data?
Well, one just thing I'll say is that I think from an empathetic perspective, I think it must be really difficult for real estate owners to manage all this stuff, right? Because, for 50 years, it's not been about how to use technology or data to make your asset better. It's just been about, feeling the dirt or smelling the dirt and, making sort of gut level decisions. And that I think has worked really well for a lot of folks in the industry. So I think it's really hard then to change the way you operate and become much more tech centric. Why we have to invest so much in software or technology or data. Oh, by the way, you have to make all these disparate systems talk to each other, which is actually really challenging. So, there's sort of, we were at RealCom conference earlier this year, and the sort of rise of the CIO within real estate companies is a big trend, right? And so investing in people who can help you make sense of this, I think, is really important. But, even huge real estate companies like Equity Office Properties probably only have 500 people on staff, because they're very lean shops relative to, this stuff. So I don't think you're ever going to be able to have a 50% team there, pulling in all these data sources. So I think what's going to have to happen, and this was similar to what I was describing about us being at WeWork, is the ability to essentially push that onto a third party who can provide that to you as a service, right? Oh, you're a real estate company, here's the sort of data connectors as a service, these types of things, in order to help the people who are really smart about real estate but maybe not as smart about data or data science get access to those types of insights. So I don't really know how that's going to work, but it's a tough challenge when you don't have huge companies from a a tech-based perspective, trying to compete for talent on data science, I just don't know how all that's going to play out.
And they're hard to find and expensive for some. I think to answer your question is you take every vertical, there are providers. So if you said you wanted GPS data or Wi-Fi data or aggregators of energy data or whatever the category is, they're there. There's no one kind of going cross-category, but the reverse is this is not like a build it and they'll come. So I don't know, everyone's in different roles, different places. You can have great data and great insights, but maybe people in an organization aren't ready to consume it. And so the best way goes back to the other thing on, sort of you pilot certain things, but look for the demand and do it. But you're never going to find a data scientist that is going to be any good in the scheme of things. And you're better kind of finding sort of certain verticals or cross correlations. Like a great one example in malls and office buildings is using Wi-Fi data real time to offset HVAC loads. I know as a fact you will drop your energy costs. And when you go in a mall, it's freezing when you go in, right? Like, there's no reason for that. There's a lot of formats in real estate where that's true. And that's taking two data sets that no one today is really aggregating together. And so you just sort of have to keep it simple and do it yourself. But each vertical's got companies in it. So it just depends what you're out for.
Yeah, I think this is part of the build versus buy, discussion in terms of technology in general. Do you want to go and build your own technology stack in-house, or do you want to outsource with partners like an MRI? Right, to kind of help you with that. I know a lot of our clients are certainly struggling with, okay, so we built this data warehouse, now what do we do with it? Okay, let's put on the front end, let's do some Tableau, let's have some business analysts kind of go in and try to mine that data. But it's very hard still to take action on that, so I think, to your point, do we hire even more data savvy people in-house to try to do that? Or can we just outsource partners that can help us make sense of that data more effectively? I think it's a mixture of both. Plugging Waypoint shamelessly, we're actually connecting to all of our clients' accounting software, so we're able to provide our clients with anonymous aggregated market data directly from accounting systems, not from brokers in the market, not from phone calls they're making from owner to owner, but rather from a single source of truth, which is that accounting system, the data that you're putting into MRI, that gets aggregated and anonymized for all of our clients to take advantage of from a market comparison perspective. So I think to the extent you can find these third parties that are a little bit more objective and certainly maybe don't have any biases in that market specifically, but are just trying to provide that kind of extra kind of data point to help you gut check some of your assumptions as an asset manager or as a property manager, then I think that type of partnership is what you should be looking for moving forward as you try to make sense of that information.
Yeah, and I'll say I agree with what they're all saying. I think it's the common theme. Let commercial real estate owners do what they do best, and then partner with data partners like MRIs of the world to figure out your data strategy. I'll give a little story. It's like I think last year the VC money that went into prop tech was about $12 billion. And so you can see that as more or less the R&D budget. So rather being an owner and investing into buying, hiring a data scientist, see this $12 billion of pool of venture capital money as basically free R&D money for you to go try out whatever vertical you're looking at in that creative R&D space.
That was a great question. Thank you. Anybody else? I had my Phil Donahue, or I guess that was kind of a dated reference.
There's no surprise guests, are there? I'm worried. No, I'm just kidding.
No long lost relatives or anything like that. Anybody else? Well, I'll give you guys each a minute to close. So Geoff, why don't you start?
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks again for having us. It's been a great partnership with MRI, and we're really happy to be here. I think just the main thing I would say is, like, we talked about a lot of different things, like drones and driverless cars and, mega trends of sort of retail to industrial. And I think probably rather than spending too much time on any like particular trend, it's probably best to just sort of like be open-minded and understand that, as technology changes, that'll cause the way people use real estate to change. And rather than focusing in on like one specific trend, just being open to learning about new things and keeping just sort of the broad trends in mind, because we don't know, what or how everything's going to shake out. So I think that's sort of the takeaways. Like, don't get caught up in one particular thing, like drones or Bitcoin or something.
Yeah, so first, thank you guys all for coming. I know it's the last day of the conference, so I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. It's been an honor and grateful to be up here with these three great guys, with representing three great companies. My kudos thing is, Pat said it at the very beginning at the opening session, truly an open, connected platform for all, and bring that into how the work is done, how a workplace is structured, how a software, how you grab data. So really just going off of that theme, going into your week, in your month, and the rest of the year, truly open and connected for all.
Yeah, and I think just, really take advantage, I'm sure you've heard it all week, but take advantage of MRI's Partner Connect program. I think, they do certainly a great job of providing you guys as their client base with a lot of different options out there to experiment and try some of these interesting ideas. Our partnership specifically with MRI allows all MRI clients to take advantage of a free market report for their portfolio with Waypoint's data. So, that's just one example. I'm sure, Honest Buildings and other partners of MRI have their own kind of unique offerings specifically for MRI clients that you should look at to help take advantage of some of these trends in the market and try to just take the leap, so to speak, without too much risk at the same time.
I don't have much more to add, so I just appreciate the time and being on the panel with everybody up here, and it was great. Thank you.
Well, guys, thank you very much. Geoff, Brian, Scott, Melissa, great insight, great information. Guys are 2 sessions away from the close of IUC, but we really appreciate all of you coming as well. And if you have some follow-up questions, you'll be able to find a lot of these guys in the Expo Center, the ecosystem, and thanks for coming to our session today.